This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
I had a completely different opening to the show until yesterday, and the different opening to the show I'll come back to.
Before we get started, though, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but I want to say something. And,
Good.
I want to know how your birthday was, because we didn't talk about it beforehand. I didn't have the opportunity to get it in right before we went on break or during break. It was your birthday, so how was it?
Oh, it was good. It's so interesting here. The way that we operate in my little house is we do a lot of stuff for each other throughout the year. So my birthday, there were a couple of things that we did, but we spent most of my birthday on set. Like that whole weekend, we had stuff that we were going to be doing, and Jamie came with me. And then for, I think the third day, Nick came with me, and it was this really, so the thing that we're shooting is about a family that went missing, and the craziest thing happened. So we get there, we're on this beautiful lakefront property, and it turns out that the name of the family was the name of the farm that we were on. And that was complete coincidence. And when we found that out, it was kind of creepy for the rest of the time.
Crazy.
Yeah. So it was really strange. And there were so many people in and out of the set so quickly that we got to meet a lot of new people. And of course, so I don't know, out in the world, we're vaccinated. So I'm vaccinated and Jamie's vaccinated, but we were like right on the edge of having the second shot and passing that period of time where you're, I don't know what they call it, but it's like a 2-week period where you're getting up to strength and your body's getting up to snuff. So I spent my birthday working. I mean, basically.
Well, it sounds like a task that was probably very enjoyable for you.
I like doing this, and this is a huge project for me. That was even like more fun. And like there were gifts exchanged or gifts were given from these guys, and we did a meal out, but like really the work stuff was my birthday. So it was fun. I mean, I like, it's still, this is like, it's hard for me to talk about this project right now with
right. And I actually didn't think about the fact that was going to come into the conversation. I just wanted to let everybody out there listening know that you did in fact have a birthday.
Yeah.
And I won't tell them how old you are or anything.
I am old, man. I am really old.
But yeah, so happy birthday. I'm a little late, but I told you happy birthday on your birthday.
You get engaged in the group chats with us too, so I appreciate you saying that.
Sure.
So that having been said, a lot of stuff is going on in true crime. Like I was working in true crime, but now I'm back to this for true crime. And this case that comes up first, we've talked about before. And we sort of talked about it because it was on Israel Key's computer.
Right. And so we're back now. We were going to have a different opening, but because of something that happened yesterday, believe it or not, we're having this opening instead. I interrupted that while ago, so I figured I'd straighten that out.
Right. So that's fine. I mean, the important part of this case was I had always believed, as far as when we were researching it, that another person from that weekend related to Israel Key's case. And that was David's case that we had looked at. But the case that we're talking about right now that has had like a lot of activity is Kristen Smart.
Right.
And Kristen Smart is one of those, I think for you and I, what is so weird about Kristen Smart is she was our age.
Right. And so you're right. And I was, my husband is not into true crime at all. And when I turned on the live stream yesterday, because they did a press conference and I wanted to hear what they were going to say, I had to give him sort of the rundown on what was happening, because he was sort of forced to listen to the guy talking. And so he wanted to know, like, okay, why are you watching this? And so what I told him was, she is, so she was 19 in 1996, and she went missing. And so she is one of I have this sort of list of girls in my lifetime who I guess could empathize with, who have gone missing. And we've talked about just about all of them. And Kristen Smart is one of the very first girls. And that's what I told my husband. She's one of the very first girls in my lifetime that went missing, that it scared me. And an interesting thing about her case was there was another girl who went missing that very same night, but her case was solved way sooner than Kristen's was. And so it wasn't a dual situation anymore. Hers was like across the country too. It was not thought that they were, related to each other, except that they just happened to disappear on the same night.
As they investigated the disappearance of 18-year-old SU student April Gregory in 1996, Syracuse police detective Nick Vassinelli and his partner learned something her family did not know. April Gregory was dating her neighbor, 30-year-old Terrence Evans.
They were seeing each other, and he would walk her back and forth to Syracuse University.
Last week, now retired Nick Vassinelli spoke about the case before a forensic science class at Syracuse University. Vassinelli told students Evans was defensive in interviews, looking away and avoiding eye contact. He was the last person who had seen Gregory, and he became the focus of the investigation.
And we used to watch his house because we felt that wherever she was, he was going to visit her. And in retrospect, that's why he never left the house, because she was right there with him.
After 5 interviews, Evans finally broke down, admitting to detectives he killed Gregory, even giving a detailed description in a videotaped confession. Evans told them he hit Gregory and she hit her head on a speaker in his room. Evans saw her unconscious and bleeding, but did nothing to help her.
Instead of calling for help or getting her treatment, he went to the store and he purchased a couple of beers.
Evans said when he came back, Gregory was dead. The details that came next, shocking even veteran homicide investigators.
So his parents had come home, so he placed her in his bed, and he wound up staying with her for 4 nights because the parents never left.
Evans told investigators he initially buried Gregory in his backyard, but later dug her up when detectives kept wanting to talk to him.
And he was nervous that we were going to show up all the time, so he had to exhume her body and bring it to a place that we would never find it.
In the videotaped confession, Evans gave police details of how he cut up Gregory's body, putting parts of her in different areas of the house he and his parents lived in.
And pulled out all of her teeth because he knew forensically that you could do dental records.
The confession was so horrifying, Vassinelli and the other detectives couldn't even be sure it was true.
The magnitude of the lengths he went to conceal his crime is just, I mean, I don't even think there's anybody out there that believes the story when I tell it to them.
In November 1997, forensic teams searched the house Evans lived in with his parents, locating April Gregory's remains. In his presentation, Vassinelli explained to current SU students what investigators had to do before they had modern DNA technology.
They went and they pulled the traps in the basement, and they wound up finding several of her teeth.
In his confession, Evans goes into details with little prompting from police. Vassinelli believes Evans may have felt some remorse in his own way.
I think that in some respects, I think he felt good to get it off of his chest.
Almost 2 decades have passed since she disappeared, but April Gregory is still remembered, and her case could help teach the next generation of forensic investigators. For now, reporting from Syracuse, I'm Alex Dunbar.
But that's how I explained it to my husband, that Kristen Smart was one of the very first cases that really just got my attention, and, it made me pay attention to crime stuff.
I had been into crime stuff, but what was so interesting about my side of that was she was pretty much girl me. Like, she was on the West Coast and I was on the East Coast, but we were like the same age. We were just getting into college, and I think she was in the same, she was in school at the same time, doing college stuff, doing all the same stupid shit that I and the people around me were doing, as far as, campus parties and wandering around inebriated and other things that related to her case.
Yeah, I wonder how many college kids in the 90s, like girls at least, I wonder how many of them thought twice before they got to the point where they needed to be helped home because of Kristen Smart's disappearance. Just like, so briefly, for somebody that perhaps is from another planet or has been living under a rock and doesn't know, Kristen Smart was 19. She disappeared on May 25th, 1996. She was last seen with Paul Flores mere feet away from the entrance of her California Polytechnic State University, which is, what is it, Cal Poly?
Probably Cal Poly, or it'd be Cal Poly.
Cal Poly. Okay, yes. She was a freshman at Cal Poly, and so she was feet away from her dorm. She was on her way home from an off-campus party, and at the time of her disappearance, she had like nothing with her. There was no signs she was going anywhere, and she literally vanished steps from her the entrance to her dorm.
Yeah, and I had spent some time looking at her case from the perspective of, could she be like a Lauren Spearer type case where someone, and I actually looked at Israel Keys for her just from the perspective that she was on his computer, and I could never make all of the things that needed to match up.
Well,
so
ultimately, for me, she was just too early for Keys.
Right. And so I actually had him in California around that time. I just had him in Northern California, having come over from Oregon and Washington area, coming down. Paul Flores has sort of been the suspect. And there's a really excellent podcast. It's 8 or 9 parts, because they've got some bonuses that he's thrown in, from a guy named Chris Lambert, who, believe it or not, he's from the area where I was going to school back in the 90s. So Chris Lambert created Your Own Backyard. And at one point I'd reached out to him because I wanted to run some ideas by him, but he was so deep into it at that point that he already had, he was hyper focused on Paul Flores. There was never going to be any like conversation outside of that, but he has done an excellent job covering it. And largely the renewed interest in this case, even yesterday, the sheriff attributed to Your Own Backyard.
Well, he didn't say the name of it.
Right. He said the podcast.
Right.
But,
and I wish he would have said it, because it's huge. It's
a
huge deal. Right. And so the podcast the sheriff was talking about during the press conference is Your Own Backyard by Chris Lambert.
Right. And it really is a fantastic listen. The initial parts of the story it's pretty tight and direct. And then he does wander a little bit afterwards. And that is because he was doing follow-up and they were paying attention. And that, I felt like that's worth noting. That
he said, the sheriff said during the press conference that there was, potential witnesses and like potential gathering of evidence that was brought to light solely from the podcast.
Yeah, and so what all that culminates in, which this is all from your notes and your numbers that you've put together. This investigation would have been going on for 25 years. In the last 10 years, law enforcement has served 41 search warrants at 16 locations and 37 items for DNA testing. They've conducted over 130 interviews. It says 137 on here, but I'm sure there's more now.
And I just want to point out, so some of the, and actually that's part of what I wanted to talk about, but we can finish this part first. But I noticed the sheriff was very proud of his tenure since 2011. He has been sheriff and I guess charged with the investigation. So that those numbers are related to his work on the case. And so before his work on the case, there was 14 years. So I thought that was interesting. That's an interesting aspect. But go ahead about it culminating.
So this culminates April 13, 2021, in the arrest of Paul Flores, who is 44 years old. He has been charged with murder. He has no bail. And his father, Ruben Flores, who is now 80 years old, was booked on an accessory charge. And he has $250,000 bail, and they are both due to be arraigned tomorrow, Thursday, the 15th of April. So we'll learn more about that.
So, okay, what do you think?
So here's my problem with all of this. I do think the podcast is amazing. I'm glad they're paying attention to this case. They pointed out they have not found her body. She has been declared dead for 19 years. She was declared dead in 2002 legally. Not having the body, I'm going to say this, and this is so wrong, but it is so true. I think that they don't have a legal case against Paul Flores, and what they are hoping for is to scare him into confessing.
I 100% agree with you.
And that's really frustrating for me.
I don't like saying that, and we both could be completely wrong, and I hope so. I hope like what they have is going to lead them to her body, but I pretty much turned the press conference off once he said, "We have not recovered Kristen," because
I did as well.
And I don't know what they found, but here's sort of what went down. They executed 4 search warrants at one time. So it was Paul's mom's house, Paul's dad's house, Paul's sister's house, and Paul's house. They did that last year. They didn't give out any information about anything that was potentially found. And then they executed some warrants more recently, I believe, at his father's house.
And his house.
And perhaps his house. Okay. And so last year, they took his mother's red Volkswagen Cabriolet. I don't know if you know about that or not, but she made a big deal out of it. And she's really mad that basically what she said was she was tired of law enforcement harassing them. And
they took other vehicles too.
They've been and I guess maybe the Cabriolet just really bothered her. And I don't know what they were looking for. I'm sure they were looking for evidence that her body had been in it. What I thought was, and I thought this when they were doing it, because, the information was sparse, but there were little blurbs in the news about the action that was happening. And I thought, well, if they execute 4 warrants at once, the reason they do that is so, nobody gets tipped off and gets rid of anything, and they don't know exactly where something might be. And so they execute them all at once. Nobody knows really what was found. And in the event he is guilty, they can play that for a while. As far as so I don't know what they could do, but let's say there's not, if they could charge him and, with the punishment being death, if they could take that off the table, if he gave them the location of her body, that's a typical play of law enforcement in situations like this. But is it just a well-strategized fishing expedition?
It is. It is, unfortunately. And here's why I say that. They said they've recovered some forensic evidence, and once I see what it is, I can give you a better idea of what's going on. But what they've really recovered was said early in the press conference and then sort of bailed on, and they weren't taking any questions, and they pointed out that all the warrants were sealed. But one of those warrants, actually 2 of those warrants, were for all of the telephonic information and communications between Paul and his family, specifically Paul and his father. And I don't know how much an 80-year-old man is texting, but in this case, I believe that whatever they've got and whatever the basis for the arrest is something that was said back and forth in the text messages. And if I'm wrong, fine, I'm wrong. But realistically, the fact that none of that was really addressed in the press conference says to me that what they got is probably more like questionable communications of, do you still have this thing? Do you remember that thing? Did they come talk to you? Did they serve a warrant with you? And I don't, that's not evidence. Not only that, if they don't have her body, and yes, there is a moratorium on the death penalty in California. However, depending on how the body was disposed of and what they can tell about the death, this would be a whole different ball game in terms of should this even be considered as a death penalty type case or a capital type case? My gut says that if Paul Flores did it, it is one of those type cases, and they don't have the evidence to do anything about it. I'm really curious if there's some kind of smoking gun in terms of forensic evidence. And if there is, these people have got to be the stupidest people ever.
I know they had 25 years to get rid of it.
25 years to get rid of it.
So let me ask you this. Especially with the father's arrest, now he's been charged with accessory. It's my thought that, first of all, a witness, I haven't actually listened to the podcast. I have seen excerpts of it elsewhere, but I'm pretty sure sort of what happened was, and there may be an account of this in the podcast. There was a female who was with Kristen. They were returning to the dorm. Paul Flores was there as well. And the female was going a different way. You know, Paul Flores said, hey, you know, I'll take her to the dorm. It's fine. It's on my way. And they weren't far away. And so the female said, well, okay. And, you know, she went about her way because the last thing she wanted to do was deal with this inebriated freshman, you know. And so, you know, obviously, I'm sure that haunted her. And it came up. And so, you know, there's this stigma that she had been drinking and that he probably had been drinking as well. And from there, especially when the dad was charged with accessory, I immediately go to accident, then panic. Because why else, for one thing, would you call your dad? And for two, would your dad do anything? Like it takes on this whole weird situation for me, because if it was a friend, even maybe a brother, I could see it like slightly different, but like it seems almost like he, you know, was trying to take advantage of her. Things got out of hand and he accidentally killed her. And then, which, you know, in that case, he really should have just called the police, because for one thing, this would not be a thing for everybody in the United States. And for another thing, he would have been done serving whatever time he got for his reckless homicide or whatever happened by now. Like it would be far over. Instead, we've all wondered all these years, you know, to the extent that we're trying to see if we can get Israel Keys there to have killed her, when all along the most obvious answer to her disappearance is more than likely going to be the actual answer if they can get the evidence. Now, I would really like to see it play out, and I'd like to know we more than likely won't ever get that, which it kind of sucks, but we've come to expect it. I don't want Paul Flores to be convicted and to plead out if he didn't do it.
Yeah, that's the problem with this case now. And that's why I was saying I felt like it was a fishing expedition, because ultimately, so here's what you want. If you're thinking that that's a fishing expedition and you had to sum it up and say, I want three things. Those three things are, one, you want to know roughly what happened that night. That's number one. Number two, you want the location of Kristen's remains. And number three, you want a plea that is appropriate. That's what you should want, not from the law enforcement perspective, but I'm now speaking to the district attorneys there, because that's where this goes next. Right now, there's still an element of this that is the law enforcement perspective, but realistically, this is now a legal matter. So once this is in the hands of some skilled attorneys on both sides, I hope, you know, on the defense side and on the prosecution side, in an ideal world, that number three thing is a coordination of the defense attorney talking to prosecution. They can come together and say, this is what happened. They're never going to admit first degree murder, but they're going to say it was manslaughter or it was second degree murder and it was this. But if they come away with him giving a version of events that can be either verified or discounted, whichever,
or even slightly believable, I think at this point would work.
Yeah, slightly believable would work. But the key to this is, where is Kristen's body? That's the thing that they need to come up with, prosecutors and law enforcement. And if law enforcement can't find it, prosecution needs to make a deal for it.
I agree. I'm not going to I would need to know where her body is. And I do think like it's sort of the ultimate in true crime if it does in fact end up being him. I don't know. And
See,
I'm not
if it's an accident though, then it's no longer true crime except for like having buried the body.
I was going to say though, keeping it a secret for 25 years, it kind of does get into true crime because even
Yeah.
the worst
Yeah.
accident that occurs, okay, even the best accident that occurs,
Right.
like the problem starts when you're trying to make it not an accident. Now, I imagine his father said, I'm not going to let this stupid thing that you did while you were drunk ruin your life. Like, that's what I imagine happening there, because I don't know of a lot of fathers that like you could be like, yeah, I murdered this girl, come help me. Like, I don't think that would be what would be happening in most cases. But so he got to live 25 years of his life, and now he's probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail. That accident component is going to be really hard to maintain at this point, even if it really was an accident. So see, he didn't really do himself any justice by prolonging it. Now, if he didn't do it, I could not have more sympathy for him. So when I was talking about the sheriff, I feel like law enforcement should be proud when they've made accomplishments. I still am not jumping for joy because like 25 years, it didn't sound to me like they had anything that the whole speech and everything that was occurring should have been occurring. It sounded to me like somebody took a leap of faith, a leap of hope, or, oh my goodness, we've got to close this case because it's driving us crazy. And I think, and sometimes that's the way things happen and that's the way things get done. And if you get a genuine confession out of somebody for it, good for you. But it's really not the way that we should do that. Law enforcement or the state's prosecution teams, they shouldn't do it that way. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that they come up with Kristen's body shortly. Now, he did mention that they were still conducting a search warrant, like as he was speaking, and that they were going to be there for a certain amount of time. So I'm hoping they got something that is leading them somewhere and they find her. That would just be, and then I'll take everything I said back, because then they deserve to be giving acknowledgement speeches and everything. But her disappearance and her life, not happening, and it being this background of sort of the rise of true crime, it is a tragedy. And until she's brought home, I don't want to hear all the stuff that I turned off. I feel like that's jumping the gun. And I also feel like it shows you how much of a variance there can be when you've got, her case, she disappeared in 96 and this sheriff came into office in 2011. So you've got 14 years, 15 years in there. And they had pretty much the same sort of information. Okay. And they could only go so far, or they felt like they could only go so far. And then you've got a new guy in town and it takes him 10 years. And, it still didn't leave me going, oh yeah, they've solved this thing.
Yeah, this is my only problem with it. It felt like the purpose of the press conference was to put pressure on Paul Flores.
Well, and to, because it helps with the illusion that we got something.
Yeah, and so the way that I'll wrap my side of this up, and you can say more if you want on Kristen Smart, by the way, but I'm just saying the way that I'll wrap my side of it up is people should listen to Your Own Backyard, to the podcast. There's multiple witnesses that come up there that weren't really a part of the investigation per se. And you can go on and listen to their Twitter and their Instagram, or Chris's Twitter and Instagram. He's actively answering questions as much as he can online on social media. And it is interesting to follow that process. I don't think I think he's more inside this case than I am, but I don't think he's so inside that he knows what's going on.
Oh yeah, I don't think so either. But I think to be an outsider, he probably has put more of it together than anybody else.
Absolutely.
And I actually don't really know a whole lot about that whole situation, but I do want to say, great job in doing what you did, because Chris Lambert's Your Own Backyard was probably essential in getting this case where it ended up yesterday. Even if it is this like sort of facade, it's still movement in the case. And it, it's not backpedaling, which is great. I really hope they find her, and I hope this ends this case. And I would be really happy with that.
Honestly, once I realized there was a prime suspect that made more sense than anything I had looked at, I didn't look super far because of the area that's in. It's resource heavy to investigate in Southern California. Like it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And Chris Lambert certainly did a fantastic job. And I think that between him and the sheriff coming in 2011, I think that the two of them have certainly gotten it to a point where there's an arrest. And I hope that something more comes from that. But, you have to wonder, like, how it's all going to end.
Is it bad that I want, like, it'd be really, like, I don't know, I don't want to say good, but like it would be really satisfying if it like went to trial and we could watch it and like actually see like the evidence unfold and like what really happened. Like, I would actually, I know that sounds terrible, and but the truth of the matter is, this is 25 years later, and rather than him just plead out and us never know anything, like, maybe we could watch it. And I feel really, that's actually really terrible. I shouldn't even say that.
And I do understand what you're saying, but I will caution you, I come from more of a defense mindset. So I will caution you that the story that you will get in a trial about this case from 25 years ago might have some accuracies to it, but overall will still just be a story that prosecutors are telling you.
Right. And the parallel roads will probably not be parallel between what we hear and what actually happened.
No, not in this case. Not that old, not that much time. Even with the best recollection and collection of evidence, it will not be as accurate as we would want it to be, unfortunately.
It seems to me like the passage of time, it works both ways, and
it's a double-edged sword.
It really is, because things do get resolved, but in this case, like, it was an impactful event. Like, her disappearance became big news quickly. So, maybe that would help people remember little things. But if they didn't realize it was, attributable to her disappearance, you've lost a lot there.
Yeah. And I'm going to segue now to this was what I was originally going to open the show with. Also, and this is a tidbit that only takes 1 second. Bernie Madoff died, by the way, today.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he died today in federal prison. I don't know how old he was, but geez, that guy. That was a Butner death, but he was in his 80s.
What does that mean?
He was in federal prison in Butner, North Carolina, so he would have been under lockdown for COVID.
Oh, well, do you know if he died of COVID?
I don't know. That's come up recently, like with several things that I've been hunting. Like, and I think something that you were trying to hunt down, you were like, is that a COVID thing? And it's such a strange thing, but I do not know if he died of COVID or not. I just know he's dead.
Well, and all life is precious. And so I'm just not going to comment on his passing.
Yeah. We'll pass. So a lot of mass shootings have taken place this year. There was one in North Carolina, down in Wilmington, but it was more of a house party situation. It's still a mass shooting. But the one that really stood out to me as something to talk about, at least briefly, as we sort of segue back into what we're covering out in Colorado, it happened on April 7th down in South Carolina. This one was bizarre to me for a number of reasons. I think it was in the middle of the afternoon because there were people working on this house. So 2 911 calls come in concerning a shooting at a residence. And this residence is within a half-hour drive of Charlotte, North Carolina, but it's in South Carolina, out in York County. So the first call comes in, and it's an air conditioning technician.
It's actually the company.
It's the dispatch.
Yeah,
is that right?
Or the supervisor. It's somebody at the company whose work people out in the field have called them. Does that make
Right.
sense? So they're
Yeah,
relaying the information.
Yeah, so two technicians are working on a job site, and one of them calls into their company dispatch screaming that the two technicians have been shot. So this technician's name is Robert Shook, and he advises that the other technician, James Lewis, is unresponsive. They were working outside the home of Dr. Robert Leslie at the time of the shooting. The two men were shot, and a gunman then forced his way into this home. So the other call to 911, so the first one being the company dispatch, the other one comes in from a neighbor who was out mowing his lawn, and he heard popping sounds. So he went in the direction of the noises to see if there's anything he could do, and he comes upon a man lying on the ground and realizes that there's a man in black clothing leaving the house that he can see, and he has heard these popping sounds enough that he thinks it's about 20 shots. So officers respond to the scene, and in addition to the victims, Robert Shook and James Lewis, Robert Shook is alive when the officers get there. James Lewis is not. They find Dr. Robert Leslie, who's 70 years old, his wife Barbara, who's 69, and two grandchildren, Ada and Noah Leslie, who are 9 and 5 respectively, have all been shot to death. Whatever they find at the scene, law enforcement goes nearby to the home of the parents of a former NFL player named Philip Adams. The Adams home is evacuated, and law enforcement attempt to talk to Phil Adams. They want him to give himself up and come out. Eventually, they discover him inside with a gunshot wound to the head that seems to be self-inflicted. Philip Adams, this former NFL player, he went and had killed 5 people. There was a 6th person, Robert Shook, that first person we talked about calling into his company. He survived for 3 days and then died in a hospital in North Carolina. A little bit about Philip Adams. He began playing football in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and then went on to South Carolina State University. He was 32 years old, and he played defensive back in the NFL, including for the 49ers, the Seahawks, the Raiders, the Jets, and the Falcons. And over his career, he had 5 interceptions, 121 tackles, and he had returned 37 punts in 73 games. He had suffered a serious ankle break in his rookie season back in 2010, and he had had a couple of concussions just a couple of weeks apart in December of 2012. And I've read some conflicting reports that Dr. Leslie and Philip Adams had some interactions over the years. I don't know exactly what they were, if they were treatment interactions or if they just lived near each other's families. But that's a total of 6 victims and Philip Adams dead in this mass shooting down there.
I have seen some more information has come out, even probably since I finished my notes, but I initially imagined that he probably treated him, and he probably treated him, because that was Philip Adams' hometown. And I imagine he had known Dr. Leslie his whole life, and he was probably his doctor. I think it had to do with a desire for some sort of narcotic and a refusal to give it to him. Now, that is hugely speculative. I have seen from, I believe it was his father was sourced as saying he was indeed at one point in time treating him for and I believe it was some of the injuries he had sustained playing football. So it would have been more recently. And so I think that he was, I don't think this was it certainly wasn't random. I feel like the doctor probably cut him off, probably had very good reasoning for whatever he did. It seems like at 70, he would have been retired. I don't actually know. There's a lot of information about Dr. Leslie out, you can Google it. And he was like he was like a world-renowned doctor. He set up programs to help people, and he was a huge part of that area of South Carolina's emergency medical services, like coming, to be more standardized. So he did a lot of stuff. And so I imagine it was a situation where he was probably doing the family a favor. And when recently information's come out about these traumatic brain injuries that football players suffer, and they don't even realize they suffer it until way later. He had 2 concussions within 2 weeks, and so that's probably damaging. And we don't really know the full effects that can end up coming from those types of injuries. And so I think I don't want to say crazy, but I think he was sort of out of his mind.
Well,
And
that is what I read, was that one of the reps, a guy named Ralph Norman, had said that pretty much what you described had caused some kind of, I don't want to say dependency because that's not the word to use, but an ongoing arrangement for medication that had recently stopped, and that may have triggered some of the events leading up to the killings, or possibly the killings themselves.
right. And so if, the doctor retired and said, yeah, you're going to need to go see this other doctor, and goes to the new doctor, and the new doctor has a different philosophy in his practice of medicine, and it doesn't include what was happening previously, I could see that causing a lot of problems. And I mean, like, problems to the extent that you force your way into someone's house after killing 2 people who are there they're probably changing out the filters of the air conditioner.
Yeah, it would have been spring maintenance.
And 2 children. I mean, come on. So it has to have been fueled by damage from the concussions and probably some sort of withdrawal, or don't really want to say dependency, but people do weird things when you are chemically dependent on something that is suddenly not there any longer.
Well, not just that part of it, but like so let's just be honest. The NFL causes injuries that normal people can't necessarily identify with, just on
absolutely,
on a weekly basis in training and practice and in gameplay. That having been said, the amount of pain someone may go through, and I'm not trying to really empathize a lot with someone who just took out all these people. I'm just thinking, if you're going through that amount of pain on a daily basis and you cannot get it under control or manageable, then there's no telling what might happen, because he's in the NFL. Whatever his position has been in the NFL is not far enough back in time that he has completely lost his form and shape. So he was an elite athlete. And by nature, he had a streak in him, whether it was aggressive or competitive or hardworking or whatever, that back up his athletic streak enough for him to be one of the elite players in the National Football League. So his pain tolerance may be different, and having suddenly gone without, say it was an opioid, I don't know that it was, I'm just saying, say that it was something that has completely allowed him to function normally, to not having any pain medication that will touch whatever is going on with his brain or with any of his injuries, including his ankle, that could definitely push him into a place that same aggressive streak that got him into the NFL in the first place, the reactive side of that is equally elite. I don't want to... Explosive. Yeah. And that type of mass shooting is so tragic because ultimately there was probably something there that, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, I'm just saying someone could have recognized that something was wrong with this guy and gotten him some kind of treatment that would have done better than the opiates. And if they couldn't, this falls into that weird rabbit hole of like, what happens to people after they do these incredibly body taxing things? Like where do they go and what do they do when they do have TBI or traumatic brain injury, or they do have like joint problems that can't be healed by normal fixes? And this is one of those possibilities. It's statistically pretty low on the list, but happening here proves that it could happen again.
I agree. I do think it's something that should be considered. Usually, if we had the opportunity to go deep enough into any sort of mass shooting that we come upon, we would, you could dissect it and you could figure out like what caused it and what caused it to the specificity of where, who, when, all of that, right? This one just seemed really like way more obvious and easy to do because it was specifically targeted, and it was with a rage because, you have to be very enraged to kill children and to kill strangers that are in your way, sort of. That's kind of how I imagined that happening. That to me would, there's people were truly horrified, I imagine, because I could only hope that they didn't even register what was happening to them, and then, they just were gone, because that kind of terror while you're sitting at home it's unthinkable.
Yeah, and, I don't cover a lot of the mass shootings that happen. I am trying to figure out if we can cover this one and put it into this episode, because I was really shocked by this particular one, by how everything went down. And that's not to say that other mass shootings aren't shocking and tragic, but this one was very terrible. Okay, so this one is not on our list, but I just want to mention it really quick, if that's okay with you. So remains found in January 22nd of this year in Molalla, Oregon, have been identified as a man named Kenneth Lee Bell, who was missing out of Contra Costa, California, since 1979. His remains were found at a work site where the crew was planting trees. There was a steep ravine off of an old service road or a private logging road. He was found there it has his personal effects on the body, and they're doing a DNA confirmation. So Bell's mother reported him missing when he was 22 years old, and he appears to have disappeared while traveling from California up into Washington State to see family. He worked in the timber industry in the 70s and frequented the Portland area at the time. Detectives at the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office tip line would like to talk to you if you knew Kenneth Bell in the late 1970s, and they can be reached at clackamas.us/sheriff/tip. That's Clackamas, CLACKAMAS.us/sheriff, SHERIFF/tip. And you can reference the case number. It's CCSO 21-00584 if you have any information on Mr. Bell in the 70s.
I don't know anything about that case. What's the manner? Is there a manner?
They haven't listed anything yet. They just want to talk to people who might have known him.
Okay. I'll have to look into that.
So that brings us back to where we were in Colorado. You had talked to me previously. You had mentioned that you felt like some of the things that were going on with cold cases were going to cause this avalanche. And I had sort of picked Colorado and some of the areas around there ahead of this because I was looking at something very specific, which I don't think we're going to get to this episode. We'll talk about one of the serial killers that's come up out there more recently. We might touch on him at the end of this episode, but he'll be next episode. I want to talk about a few cases
that illustrated my point.
Yeah, I want to talk about a few cases that illustrated your point. I was just trying to say that without the dogs clicking through. There were several of them that just suddenly this year.
Avalanche?
Yeah, it's that avalanche you talked about. It's literally that avalanche, and I thought it was ironic that there's an avalanche in Colorado. Anyways.
Well, it's an avalanche of cold cases being solved, and a lot. So while they are coming sort of to light right now, I guess maybe the past 5 or 6 years, I think it's been the buildup that we're about to experience, and that being this odd phenomenon. It's not really odd, but it's surprising with the genetic genealogy and the DNA sort of discoveries that are coming about. And yeah, when I was working on the notes, I was actually surprised at how just boom, 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 the examples are becoming.
Yeah, we've been mentioning them as we go along. I just didn't realize that there were so many of them.
Right. And it's going to be even more. And I'm really it seems like we've mentioned before through the show, not us talking, but other sources, about this technology that is, we are going to see more and more cases. And it's been going on for quite a while now. I know we did Tom and Jerry last year, and that sort of It was the story about the mom who had triplets, and she wanted to know which 2 of her 3 triplets were identical twins, which was a fraternal, or I guess identical triplets and the fraternal triplets. So, that was just a random article I came across, and they discovered that their grandfather, the triplets' grandfather, had been abducted as a child. And I don't know if he was sold or how that came into play, but he ended up, being adopted by another family. And it just brought all the stuff to light. And it was really interesting. And so from there, we've tried to interject a little bit of the DNA findings that law enforcement is using. Technology is evolving, and it's evolving quickly. In sort of that research, we've been doing Colorado, looking at different cases, and I was talking about an avalanche of cases, and I don't know that John immediately grasped what I was saying, but he was able to pick up on it really quick from news articles. And so one of the first ones we're going to talk about today is Sylvia Quayle. She was 34 years old when she was found dead by her father on August the 4th, 1981, in her Cherry Hills Village apartment. So on February 25th of 2021, 39 years later, police arrested 62-year-old David Dwayne Anderson in Nebraska based on new DNA testing. After obtaining a sequenced DNA profile from the biological sample collected at the crime scene in 1981, investigators were able to match the profile of a distant relative of the perpetrator by comparing the profile against profiles within the open source DNA databases that are available. From there, investigators conducted extensive background genealogical work to narrow down potential suspects. And after they had David Dwayne Anderson in their sights as a possible perpetrator in her murder, they collected bags of trash that he had discarded for pickup, and a can of vanilla Coke in there had his DNA on it, that they were able to obtain a profile that matched the DNA profile recovered from Sylvia's murder scene. And so 39 years later, he was arrested for her murder.
Right. And so this case came up recently. Like, we've had some audio in here, and we briefly talked about this happening. But one of the interesting parts of that is that that's 2021 that it's happening at. It's happening now.
I know. Just 2 months ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, in the last couple of years, how many different cases were happening in the area I had focused in on where they're starting to be solved. So we have Sylvia, that's number one. And then we have Jeannie Moore. She was 18 when she disappeared in August of 1981. Her body was found by picnickers in a local park 5 days later. And in 2019, investigators linked DNA from that crime scene to Donald Peria, who had died in 2012. You have to start putting these people on a list. Donald Peria, he's passed away, but still, David Dwayne Anderson, you've got to look at DNA from old crime scenes where these people need to be in a database where other crimes that are being looked at cold case wise, they should be compared in those instances. That is my opinion on this, by the way.
Well, sure. And with Jeannie Moore being found in a park, outside, you've got to wonder, was that the only time that guy did that? And then
that's exactly what I mean. That
right.
Thinking right there, how do we capture that and start looking at MOs and including DNA?
And something that I couldn't really find, and I pondered it just briefly because I was trying to, get the information. But Donald Peria died in 2012. And do they consider the case closed?
Yeah, they consider this case to be closed.
Because, he wasn't convicted of it. That was one of my biggest,
I know.
points of contention about Israel Keys, because he is one of the only admitted but not convicted serial killers.
Right, that isn't convicted of anything.
He was never convicted of anything. And that really sticks in my craw. But I'm just curious. I feel like a DNA match is enough to close it, in my opinion, as long as you don't get a bunch of investigators abusing that position, like using it to close cases. I can understand where the pressure of trying to solve things versus your ability to do so would cause you to be like, oh, well, all these people's perpetrators died and the cases are closed. And hopefully, that won't start happening. We'll see, I guess. The next case, we've got Helen Przezinski. She was 21 when she was found dead in a Douglas County field on January 17th, 1980. And that was just one day after she disappeared. In December of 2019, James Clanton was arrested in Florida after DNA recovered from the crime scene eventually led investigators to track him down. Within 2 years of Helen's murder, James Clanton had moved to Florida and changed his name to avoid being caught for the murder. He was previously known as Curtis Allen White at the time he committed the murder. So investigators were able to track him down despite him moving and changing his name. And ultimately, they collected a beer mug from a bar that he was at to confirm his DNA matched the DNA found at Helen's crime scene.
He pled guilty.
Yeah, like really quick. So they took him into custody and he pled guilty shortly after he was arrested. But like he changed his name.
Well, there's another.
You cannot hide.
I know. There's another guy though up in Canada that I never have been able to figure out if he died. So I'm still hunting him. We talked about him in another episode. This guy David Harry Fisher. I'm still hunting that guy because I can't tell if he like could have committed other crimes or it was a one-off or if he got screwed. And I've just been hunting and hunting for that guy. Somehow he's like this dude. He changes his name a lot. So he sort of vanishes into the ether after he gets off his parole in Washington State. He should be around somewhere. I should be able to find an obituary for him. And I can't find him at all.
Yeah, I briefly looked at that and I couldn't find anything. And I may go back and look somewhere, but I ultimately felt like he wasn't going to take a chance again.
Yeah, I even wondered if he even did the first crime, honestly, because I sort of felt like maybe it was a really short sentence that came out of it all. And I wondered if they had just jumped the gun on it and they had somebody so they convicted him, which is another type of case that drives me nuts, where it's not so much that you get a false confession. You just end up with a bullshit plea deal because of the pressure the prosecutors put on the defendant. And you don't necessarily close the case. You just get a conviction out of it. But it's the wrong conviction, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, that makes me think of all these, what was it? The Memphis 3?
Yeah, the West Memphis 3.
The West Memphis 3. Wait, is that the 3 little boy? That about the 3 little boys?
Yeah.
Okay, so their convicted killers ultimately didn't do it. And
they took the blame for it, though.
Well, right, that's what I was about to say. But because they Alfred pled it, the case won't be reopened, and the real perpetrator will not be caught and convicted.
Right.
Even though they got out of jail, they were not exonerated. All the ins and outs of that case. So what ends up happening is, you get fresh investigators and fresh prosecution, and they say, oh, wait, this is wrong. Like, this shouldn't have happened. We talked about the other case with Joe White and his 5 cohorts the other day.
The Beatrice 6.
Yes, the Beatrice 6. You end up in a situation, though, where with the West Memphis 3, they didn't do it. There was actually pretty substantial evidence that they didn't do it. But those boys that were killed, they don't get justice.
Right. Not at all.
No, they don't. And so, but in order, it's not, what is happening there is not right. And I don't know, how to explain that. And I don't even really want to explain that to anyone. It is whoever made that decision, and I don't say this lightly, whoever made that decision doesn't need to be in the position that they're in, because they ultimately they denied everybody justice by an Alford plea. An Alford plea is where you are not saying that you're guilty of a crime, but you are acknowledging the fact that there's enough evidence for you to be convicted. And I feel like doing that after they've spent, so much time in jail. I mean, yeah, there was enough evidence for them to be convicted. They were convicted. So, therefore, duh. But to then say, oh, but we're going to let you out.
Yeah, and so there's cases like that involve murder, but there's been this spate of rape cases that have been overturned because of bad witness identification, and then later on DNA clears that person. And if you can pretty much pick up a newspaper or go to your favorite news website, I guess is the thing now, any day of the week, and you can read about some case where someone has been found innocent. So just like the West Memphis 3, those cases, they just sit there open forever and ever and ever. It's bizarre.
But the West Memphis 3 case is adjudicated as they were found guilty. The plea of the Alford plea stands as a guilty.
But we know they didn't do it.
Okay, but nobody's looking into the actual suspect because the case is closed.
Well, that one's big enough and famous enough that I'm sure resources are being dumped into it from private sources, but it'll never be solved officially because it is solved officially.
This is a real problem. It really is. It's a real problem because the person who killed those boys got away with it. And maybe there are private investigators looking into it, but I'm telling you, the fact that, someone has been convicted of it and an Alford plea does not take away that conviction.
I agree.
It's not going to be reopened. It's not going to be relooked into. It is what it is. And so no one will ever face their crime.
Well, no one will ever face the West Memphis 3 crime. Because of everything that you've described. So we've got Tansy Sims. She was 25 when she was found murdered in an alley in Aurora, Colorado on October 24th of 1996. Investigators were later able to reanalyze DNA recovered from that crime scene, and they located an immediate member of the suspect's family, who is Wesley Blackman. He would have been 41 years old in 1996 and was eventually confirmed to be the suspect in Tansy's murder, even though Wesley died in 2008. That one bothers me for a number of reasons, because there are other reasons that a family member's DNA could be involved. So I hope that one is tight and it is not some nonsense.
That's actually what I thought. It does not say anywhere that it was specifically matched. It was worded very carefully. I honestly feel like, so I can point out, I did not put that she was a prostitute murder.
Right.
I'm just saying. But, it makes me wonder
but she was stabbed to death in an alley.
Yeah, she was, yeah.
But that was
they never say. I had to make it, I read the headline, I read the case, I get it. But I had to put together what I could to make it actually seem like they were saying anything at all there.
Yeah, so this is another United Data Connect case. And I actually know more about this. The thing is, this was treated like a nothing case and like it was closed with a blurb. But
yeah, because she was a prostitute.
Right. But it
was treated like a prostitute murder.
Right. She was stabbed. And the killer cut himself at the scene is the idea. And then that's how they get back to Wesley. So
right. And so he was already dead. And what I assume is they didn't actually have his DNA to compare the crime scene DNA with.
Right.
Right? Okay, because he died in 2008. That they had the crime scene DNA, they sequenced it. And so when you're sequencing DNA, it's different than when you're analyzing it for crime value. But by sequencing it, they were able to identify somebody who was closely related to him. And through further investigation that didn't involve, DNA evidence, an assumption or a presumption was made that it was him.
Right. They found enough evidence of the suspects. They found enough DNA to narrow it down to a close relative. And basically, this is one of those over-the-road trucker cases. And also, one of the reasons that not as much is released about this is because I went hunting on this one. They actually are trying to determine now if Blackman was one of the trucker killers.
I think his name is Backman.
Backman? Did I say it wrong the whole time?
Backman. I don't know.
They think that this suspect may be one of the trucker murderers.
In order for me to go, yay, they solved that, I would need to know that they had exhumed his body and got a DNA sample from him and that it matched the crime scene, because they didn't do that. What they did was they found a closely related genetic match. And they went to that person and they cooperated. And so somebody said, oh, well, this is close enough. But they didn't take it and close the circle. And unless his, body is not available for some reason, to me, now maybe I've read it incorrectly, and maybe it was a sibling and it was close enough for them to definitively say that it was in fact his DNA. But that's not what was put in the article.
I will go hunting for Wesley Backman's DNA story, because that one is at a company that I am very much interested in covering more of their work. So I will go look and see what that is. And if I can find something, I'll come back to that.
Wesley Backman.
Wesley Backman.
Backman. Yeah.
Backman. Wesley Backman. So in addition to Tansy Sims' case and the potential identification of Wesley Backman in 1996 being her murderer, he was 41 years old in 1996. And it's thought that, there's a whole highway thing going on there. I'm angry about it, so I'm not going to get into it right this second. But
do you think if she wasn't a prostitute that they would have finished the DNA circle?
Maybe.
I don't know if it. I don't know. I just know that
he may have been dug up at this point, or he may not be dig-upable. And
I'm just saying that, when it says this cold case has been solved, which, I mean, it sort of looks like they're trying to solve it, and that it definitely looks like they're done.
I think they're done with this case, but they're holding back information because they think he's done more.
So I hope that that's the case. I think they got close enough and they just said, well, it's close enough. I mean, it's just a prostitute murder.
I'm angry because the FBI project, there's a whole thing where the FBI has this interstate killers thing that they're doing, and they don't necessarily include Colorado. I don't know why. There's a lot of things that get left out of Colorado.
What?
Yeah. But this is one of those cases. Well, I don't know. This would fall into the time period and the time frame and the MO of it all. I don't know why it's not included in the law. So next up, we have Rainbow Falls Jane Doe. She was found in 1993 at the Pike and San Isabel National Forest in Douglas County, Colorado. Investigators were finally able to use that DNA sequencing you talked about and genetic genealogy to narrow down who she could be and to positively identify her. Now, her killer has not been identified, but Rainbow Falls Jane Doe, who we've talked about before, is Becky Redeker. She has now been officially identified.
That was so sad.
Yeah. And
because she was a missing person who was found, I assume, just days after she was missing.
Yeah, she was.
It took that long for her to be identified.
She was missing, but she really wasn't missing. She was there the whole time.
And she couldn't be the unidentified Jane Doe that she was until she was reunited with her name. The shape that the remains were in weren't so they could identify it. And so that's why it took so long, basically. But her family could have known way sooner.
Yeah. So then we have the arrest last year during the pandemic. They arrested Brent Bloomquist, 63, after a familial DNA profile was developed from evidence collected in a 2002 sexual assault case involving a 60-something female victim who has not been identified. Bloomquist has pled guilty to felony kidnapping and attempted sexual assault charges in the months just after his arrest.
I would love to talk to that guy.
That guy's been up to some shit, hasn't he?
I would want to know. So I would want to be like, did you expect it?
Yeah, like were you looking over your shoulder the whole time?
Like how
what
long,
else did you do?
When did it occur to you that like you made a mistake in attacking this woman and that, somebody on their toes
He's gonna catch your ass.
And so I would like to know, it's a phenomenon that we're probably never going to know that side of it. But I would like to know, like, did it come out of the blue? Did you suffer, like, wondering? I would love to know people, because right now is this time where people were alive and committing violent crimes against others and not aware that in a short while, DNA was going to identify them.
Yeah, well,
okay. And that won't happen again because it's a thing now. So everybody realizes that. You see the difference there? It's a thing where there was this momentary lapse of not realizing that I'm leaving identifying things behind.
Yeah. And that one was different for a number of reasons. So that's an old case, 2002. It's not as old as some of these cases we're talking about.
Well, she wasn't murdered. She was just assaulted.
Right. But what was different about it was, if you notice the time frame there from 2002 to 2020, what they did was they knew they had DNA because it's 2002. They just didn't know who it was. So they filed it on a warrant to arrest a John Doe suspect. And what that did was it told the statute of limitations, and it gave them time to identify him. But it also basically made him, this John Doe, a fugitive from justice the entire time, fleeing arrest. So essentially, some of those cases
they issued an arrest warrant for the DNA profile. It was an awesome move.
Yeah, it was a really smart move.
It was a little bit ahead of its time, but it held up. I mean, because essentially they've got enough to identify the person, and you can contest it by having your DNA not match the profile that the arrest warrant is issued against.
Yeah, and that was fascinating to me, to say the very least. I was really interested to see. He was supposed to have been sentenced recently, and I was looking to see what he got out of it.
He pleaded guilty.
He pled guilty, but his sentencing was scheduled for, I think, maybe February of 2021. I was trying to find his sentencing. Like, what was he sentenced to? And I can't find it yet.
I wonder, because it did end up being a familial DNA match. So he was never entered into CODIS as an offender, right?
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm wondering, like, how did this all go down in terms of how did it affect his sentence? 2, have they run him for other crimes? And 3, is he an open investigation, which is why it was difficult for me to find other information about him. That's what I really want to know. Because you were saying, like, I want to ask him, like, this question. I want to know.
I want to know from, like, I just want to know, like, what it felt like to be, like, one of those morons who did something bad thinking they had gotten away with it. And then it caught up with them. And I don't know why I'm fascinated with that. It's just, I feel like, and it's not just women, but a lot of these victims are women, and a lot of the perpetrators are men. And so I feel like it's sort of a shooting them the bird, really. I mean, it's a very empowering thought that these, the perpetrators that thought they got away with something didn't. And, after 20 some years, it's gotta be shocking to be caught.
It probably is a little bit shocking.
And so now everybody realizes it. Well, I assume everybody realizes that. I don't know that everybody's making the whole sequencing family relation connection.
Right.
I don't know that everybody realizes how that works.
Right.
And so I think that they are genuinely shocked, because while they may not have, they don't have complete control over their DNA. And so I'm starting to wonder, I have seen where ultimately what happens is once they get it narrowed down, they've got to follow, whoever the last suspects are. Like if they're, because usually, you go back a certain number of generations and then you get information and then you find, and it's usually a group of siblings, right? Because siblings, there would be enough DNA that it would match all of them, except some of it wouldn't match. And that would be how you figured out which one you wanted, right? And so they go and follow them around. And I've seen on different accounts of this happening, investigators come across perpetrators or potential suspects that will not leave their DNA anywhere. And that makes
Do you think they're paranoid and that's what's going on? Are you talking about D'Angelo? The Golden State Killer was that he was one of those.
I don't know about him, but the guy that killed Mandy Stebeck.
Okay.
His employer remembered the murder. There was a tip, or they had come to suspect him. And it ended up, his employer was like, oh, you want me to help you guys get his DNA? Okay, sure, I'll do it, right? Because she wanted Mandy's murder to be solved. And he worked in a bakery. And so at the behest of the cops, she volunteered to try to get a DNA sample from him. And they worked in the same building. And there was only 3 or 4 employees.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it took her 3 months to get the sample because he never left anything anywhere. And she was like, this is insane. And so I do think he was paranoid.
Yeah, he probably was. I don't remember if he said anything about it. I haven't heard that guy. That guy's name is Tim Bass, and I haven't heard him speak.
He said that, okay, so this is what happened. He was going to blame his dad, who had passed away. And then he tried to get his brother to say something like, oh, yeah, we both were, engaging in consensual sexual relationships with her. And so that made me realize, this guy doesn't realize how DNA works. Because he thought, oh, it's clear. Because ultimately, the DNA sample recovered from Mandy's body, it would, with a direct comparison, it would match him, and it would not match his brother nor his father. Okay, that's a direct comparison where you're looking at a very specific set of circumstances, and so his plan never would have worked. But even the people he was talking to about it were going, okay, yeah, you totally did this. And, they were, his mother was like, you are not going to drag your father's name through the mud. And his brother was like, I'm not doing that. And, pretty normal reactions. But he legitimately thought he could somehow off-put the blame or mix up the blame or something. And I just thought, their DNA now, okay, if they didn't have that very specific situation, it's not like you can do that off of, everybody on earth. You can't make that specific comparison. It's got to get narrowed down in other ways. But DNA would be able to pinpoint the actual perpetrator, even amongst, his relatives that shared quite a bit of DNA, because his brother and he would get 50% of their DNA from each of their parents. And so a lot of that DNA would overlap, but all of it would not.
That leads us to the next case, which has also got a weird DNA collection. Roger Dean was murdered at his Lone Tree home on November 21st, 1985. He was 51 years old. A perpetrator wearing a ski mask entered the house and forced Roger to tie up his wife and demanded $30,000 that Roger and his wife had in their savings account. An altercation ensued that ended in gunfire, and the gunfire killed Roger. In the chaos of this encounter, the perpetrator leaves behind a ski mask that he's wearing. So hair from that ski mask leads investigators to determine the identity of the suspect's parents. And detectives intercept a water bottle on an airline flight to make the genealogical connection here. So Michael Jefferson, he was just taken into custody last week for a 1985 murder. He was taken into custody on Friday, April 9th. He's facing charges for the first-degree murder and kidnapping of Roger Dean. And so while the DNA connection has been made public, we don't know why he did this crime. We don't know what other evidence they have about it. We just know that right now, Michael Jefferson is charged with the murder of Roger Dean. And this is another, they picked him up in Los Angeles, but this is another Colorado murder being solved with weird genealogical connections. In this instance.
You remember this case?
Yeah, why?
I was just curious. Because I remember it. Like, I remember it actually very clearly. And I'm so glad that they...
Yeah, this shocked me. I was so shocked that I was able to put this on the list. I was like, what?
It came right because it has just been solved, and it has been a situation. And like I said, we don't know what the motivation was. It could have been random. It could have been, we don't know yet because it literally just happened. But so his parents had their DNA publicly available. And so it was down to him and his brother. And they don't talk about like if they got a sample from the brother or not, because they got a sample from him and it matched. But I imagine they probably got a sample from his brother as well and it didn't match. But I'm so fascinated by these cases. And I want to be like, well, did you have to follow him around like a lot? Because, they end up getting it from a airplane.
It's called surveilling.
I understand
not
that,
following them around. It's not stalking them.
Okay, did you have to surveil him a lot? I just am fascinated with it because I personally, if somebody wanted to obtain my DNA, they would have no problem getting it because it doesn't even cross my mind that's there could possibly be somebody trying to obtain it. Now, you made a joke that took me a while to get when we were talking at some point in time, and you're like, it's not like you're going to get charged for a crime committed in your house because I don't go anywhere. But, I do find it, I find these little tidbits of, kind of stories that go along with these cases. It's interesting because I think that it's like a little bit of extra justice happening.
Well, what was that sentence supposed to say originally? Detectives intercepted a
In order.
In order. You said ignorer on my copy of the notes.
I know. I just see that, and I'm sorry, and I realize that, but I promise you, I put in order. So detectives intercepted a water bottle on the airline flight in order to make the genealogical connection.
Right. Okay, I get it.
That's how they got his DNA. Yeah.
Okay, so we have one last case today that is also sort of new-ish. And I had mentioned this. I don't think we've mentioned it on here yet, but Weld County in this area I was looking at, they finally have a cold case detective. And there's a bunch of like cold cases I've been looking at in this area, but they have a detective now as of like halfway through last year during the pandemic. They hired one. They got a grant to put a detective on these cases. And Evelyn Day, she was 29. She never returned home from work on November 26th of 1979. Her husband reported her missing, and she was found murdered in her car on November 27th, so the next day. So November 26th, she goes missing. Husband reports her missing. She disappears, and the husband reports her missing. She's found the next day murdered. That's 41 years ago. So it was the second oldest cold case homicide in Weld County, Colorado. Well, authorities have now arrested James Herman Dye, who is 64, of Wichita, Kansas, and they charged him with 2 counts of murder. There was a tip. They ultimately led the investigators to compare Dye's DNA with DNA evidence collected from the scene, and it produced a match and also closure. I cannot imagine what Mr. Day felt after all these years. It does look like he's still alive. He's just very old, but that one being closed was a big deal.
Right, because it had been on the radar for so long, and it was a big deal. She left behind, I know she had at least one small child. I don't know. There may have been more than one small child, but she just never came home.
I was trying to find the number of children there. Have you seen anything in that case? Have you seen any of the pictures?
Yeah, I think so.
James Herman Dye looks like a character from either a Harry Potter movie or an Adam Sandler movie. He has a very lengthy record, by the way.
I know. And so that's the other thing, like, I didn't put it in the notes because I don't want to like be condescending, but it seemed like his DNA would have been available like a lot sooner.
That's what I wanted to ask you about that. So do you think
it looks like it would have been, but they needed the tip.
So he was 23. He was 23 when this happened. He had a lengthy criminal record. But here's what I wanted to ask you. Do you think because his crimes occurred in the 70s and 80s, they wouldn't have kept the DNA? Because he had a lot of like assaults on a child and sexual assaults. They were in like the late 70s, early 80s. Do you think that affected him being caught?
Possibly. I do know that. So the retroactive aspect of the idea behind CODIS, it's not, from what I've observed, it's not implemented like in a standardized way. And so what ends up happening is like if you don't commit a crime in a certain amount of time, your DNA is not put in the system, you are potentially released, and then it only gets put in if you commit another crime and get caught, and then your DNA is put into the system. Now, I think they should take their DNA on the way out, but for certain crimes, I don't know what the DNA laws are forever changing, but I know that, some of the propositions that have been made are that like every felony violent crime, everyone who's convicted of a felony violent crime has to give a DNA sample to be put into CODIS. I don't know that that's actually happening. So yes, there is a gap of time where the only way some offenders were going to be getting DNA put into CODIS was if they recommitted another crime.
Right. And that was one of the things I was specifically thinking about with his case.
I don't know for sure. I tried to look because it was in the database at some point because I don't think they obtained like a direct sample from him.
They didn't know to check against something right there.
They didn't know to check against him, but there was a tip. And what they did was, so there was all kinds of circumstantial evidence that led to him once somebody gave them the right, shove in that direction, because like he had been on the campus where she was last seen, right. And like it was just all this stuff that added up, and then the DNA match was just icing on the cake, and that is actual evidence. It's not circumstantial any longer, but so while that seals the deal there, and I don't want to like jump or be condescending towards law enforcement, because I get where like it would be a very overwhelming sense of chaos to think, where you want to write the fact that you've got this gap of offenders getting out, recommitting crimes, and only then having their DNA when you had them to begin with. But it's an interesting time we live in, because I don't know that, I don't know that there's ever been anything in the realm of evidence convicting people of crimes. I don't know that there's ever been anything like DNA. I don't think fingerprints were quite as big of a deal.
And they're not as unique as we thought.
Yeah, that's true. But, so I do kind of keep wondering when the bottom of DNA is going to fall out, but I don't know that it's going to anymore. I've seen enough to personally believe in it and believe in the uniqueness of it.
But in cases like that, that's different, because like she was killed by manual strangulation. There was, a rape kit done, and then that DNA was run. And so the court documents I read on that case, there was a tip and a CODIS hit like at the same time that made it all come together. The tip was like a Crime Stoppers tip. It was pretty interesting. And then the CODIS hit happened because they were like trying to run cold case stuff on that case. But here's my thought on what you just said. Like, is there a bottom to DNA? If this was like a really weird piece of terminology where it was a fraction of sperm that they were testing the DNA of. So it is a direct biological sample. But let's say, for instance, she wasn't sexually assaulted, and that was just the person she had sex with before she died.
Right, but
that's where the DNA bottom is. The DNA bottom comes from people who...
That's why they established before they let them know about the evidence that they didn't have a relationship.
Right,
that's
right.
Why they do that.
Yeah, no, I get that, but I'm saying that's where the problem becomes in the future. It's from DNA, like trash collected on the side of the road.
Well, yeah. If they say, yeah, we were seeing each other and we were intimate partners, then that blows that out of the water.
So this is like our Colorado cases for this week. This is pretty much all of them. I want to mention one last thing, and this is a Colorado Springs case from November of 2014. This is not a DNA-related case. Clinton Anthony John Sutton has been missing since November 6th of 2014. He was last seen close to the South Nevada Avenue area in Colorado Springs. His stepfather, Gary Jameson, dropped Clinton and a friend off. Clinton told him that he would call him the following day. Now, close to 7 years later, he hasn't called. So authorities consider Clinton's disappearance to be suspicious. If you have any information of his whereabouts, you're asked to contact the Colorado Springs Police Department at 719-444-7000 or Crime Stoppers anonymously at 719-634-7867. That's the Colorado Springs Police Department at 719-444-7000 or Crime Stoppers at 719-634-7867. And I will put a link to Clinton's case in the show notes. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LABROTTIECREATIONS.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Tony Coppola, and I am the Public Information Officer with the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office. Today is a day that many had hoped for, wished for, and prayed for. We have major developments in the Kristen Smart investigation. Let's begin the news conference now by introducing the President of Cal Poly, Jeff Armstrong, Robin Babb, Cal Poly Police Chief George Hughes, Under Sheriff Jim Vogue, and San Luis Obispo County Sheriff Ian Parkinson. Sheriff.
Good afternoon. The one person that was not introduced standing up front is Detective Clint Cole, who is our unsolved cold case detective, and I wanted to introduce him myself. I also have several members of my staff that are, excuse me, out in the audience. So my name is Sheriff Ian Parkinson. I'm joined here obviously by the President of Cal Poly, Jeff Armstrong. I want to begin today, or we're beginning here today, because this is where it all began on the campus of Cal Poly University. On May 25th, 1996, this was the last place that Kristen Smart was seen alive. It has been 24, almost 25 years since Kristen went missing. 24 years without a resolution until today. I'm here this afternoon to announce the arrest of Paul Flores for the murder of Kristen Smart and the arrest of his father, Ruben Flores, as an accessory to the murder. I want to start just with a little timeline for those who may not follow this completely. So how did we get here? It's been a long process. Kristen Smart was a 19-year-old freshman Cal Poly student in May of 1996. She was last seen on May 25th of 1996 at approximately 2 a.m. near the intersection of Perimeter and Grand Avenue, which is right over my left shoulder, as she walked home from an off-campus party. Kristen was last seen with Paul Flores, also a 19-year-old freshman that walked her home from the party. Kristen never returned to her dorm room that night and has not been seen or heard from since that time. She was reported missing to the Cal Poly Police Department on May 28, 1996. Cal Poly Police handled the initial investigation into her disappearance with the assistance of investigators from the San Luis Obispo County District Attorney's Office. On June 26, 1996, about a month later, the San Luis Sheriff's Office assumed the lead investigation in the case. We have actively investigated the case since that time. We have received assistance from the FBI, California Department of Justice, numerous other law enforcement agencies throughout the state of California and actually out of the state of California. I introduced Detective Cole for a reason. About 4 years ago, the Board of Supervisors, and I think the chair of the board, Lynn Compton, is here, granted a request that I had for a unsolved cold case detective. Many of our cold cases are actually assigned to our detectives in addition to their normal caseload, and Kristen's was one of those cases. Kristen's was one of the cases that I targeted for this position, and after granting that position, Detective Cole assumed that position and has been working on Kristen's case since then. Throughout our investigation, Paul Flores has remained a person of significant interest. There's been some discussion of what is a person of interest versus a suspect, and it's really a matter of terminology. When a crime occurs, everybody involved in that area could be a person of interest until they're ruled no longer of interest, either through alibi, through witness, through physical evidence. But Paul remained as a person of interest, and as the case progressed, became a suspect and the prime suspect in the case. So I became sheriff in 2011 and did a complete and requested a complete review of all the physical evidence that had ever been taken in the missing person case. In late 2016, we discovered additional evidence that confirmed that Paul was the suspect in the disappearance. In 2019, we interviewed several witnesses that had not been previously interviewed, and I'll say some of that information came to light through the podcast that many of you are familiar with, that was produced and eventually led to our interviewing that witness. And with the knowledge of the discovered of new evidence, new witnesses, sheriff's detectives secured a court order authorizing the interception and monitoring of Paul Flores' cell phone and text messages. This is one of many things that have been done over the last 10 years. In February of 2020, detectives served search warrants at the home of Paul Flores, as well as his sister, mother, and father, all simultaneously last year. Physical evidence recovered during these searches led to the service of additional search warrant at Paul Flores' residence in April of last year. During the search warrant, detectives recovered evidence related to the murder of Kristen Smart. In March of this year, detectives served another search warrant in Arroyo Grande at the home of Ruben Flores, the father of Paul Flores. Additional evidence related to the Smart investigation was discovered at that time. So as a result of this evidence, a San Luis Obispo Superior Court judge signed 2 arrest warrants and 2 additional search warrants. At approximately 07:30 this morning, today. Both were arrested simultaneously with a team down in San Pedro, California, and a team in Arroyo Grande, California. And they arrested Paul Flores and his father, Ruben. Paul was arrested for charge of murder with zero bail, meaning he is unable to bail. And Ruben Flores was arrested as an accessory to murder with a bail of $250,000. We are still currently in the process of executing those search warrants. Could be there for the remainder of the day or even into tomorrow, depending on what they find. Now, I understand a lot of people want to know what we found in the detail, and that's kind of the question that people continuously ask us and ask me is, what exactly did you find and what exactly do they have that has led to this? Well, I can tell you, unfortunately, the search warrants were sealed, which means I cannot discuss what evidence was found, and probably more importantly is that we have a due process right now, and everybody here is allowed that due process right. That means it has to go to court. There has to be a trial of 12 people and decide his guilt or innocence. So discussing specific evidence is just not appropriate at this point. I will say this, and this is probably a question that I will answer at this point, that we have not recovered Kristen. We will continue to focus on finding her remains regardless of any court action. So we will continue the process of finding out where Kristen is. We know that's an important part or important issue with the family. When I took office, one of the first acts that I mentioned was re-examining starting from the beginning, and I often tell people this, that law enforcement solves crimes really two ways, through witnesses and physical evidence. When we lack witnesses, we rely on physical evidence. You hear it in the news all the time about physical evidence that has linked somebody to a crime. Well, that's extremely important to solving a crime. In this case, we were dealing with a case that was, at my point of coming in office, about 14 years old, which makes it very difficult. Since that time, I believe there's a list somewhere, I can't see it, probably somewhere over here. Thank you. That is highlighting what I'm just about to tell you. Since I came in office in 2011, we've served over 41 search warrants on this case, done physical searches of 16 different locations, one of which was back on the back hill, you may remember a few years ago, a complete re-examination of every physical item seized, submission of 37 items of evidence from the early days of the case for modern DNA testing, recovery of 193 items of physical evidence, new physical evidence. We've conducted approximately 137 person-to-person interviews, and in addition, completed over 500 additional police reports. I can tell you this file, the size of it is probably in the size, if you put it on a hard drive, it's in excess of 3 terabytes. It's that much involved in this case. It's my hope that we're able to take the first step toward justice for the Smart family. Peace for the community, some justice out there for all of us, and most especially for Kristen. I have spoken to the Smart family numerous times, including this morning, matter of fact, twice today. I think they're feeling a bit of relief, but as you can imagine, until we return Kristen to them, this is not over, and we have committed to them that we are not going to stop until Kristen has been recovered, no matter what the cost, no matter what the time. We're committed to that, and I know they believe in us. I know they believe that we will find Kristen. So this afternoon, we have turned the case over to the San Luis Obispo District Attorney's Office. The way the process works, the warrants that were signed by the Superior Court allowed for the arrest and booking of Paul and his father, Ruben. Now the case has been handed to the District Attorney for review and their announcement of further proceedings I'd like to thank my investigators. There was certainly the investigator that I introduced, Detective Cole, but there was Detective Commander that's in the audience, a new Detective Commander, many people over the years that have worked on this case. I think the people that are representing here today, myself, the Chief of Cal Poly Police, weren't part of this investigation, weren't part of this agency that we are all in when this happened. And I think the cooperation that's taken place, I know President Armstrong has really opened the door for us to do and provide us anything that he possibly can, including having this press conference here in Cal Poly today. So I'd like to introduce President Armstrong to say a few words.
Thank you, Sheriff Parkinson. I appreciate so many members of the Cal Poly and Central Coast community, San Luis Obispo, being here today. Our Cal Poly and Central Coast communities have watched the case of Kristen Smart's disappearance closely and hope for justice for Kristen and resolution for the family for years. The news today of arrest in connection with the case brings sadness, but also a measure of relief and hope for resolution. While we know that today's developments do not represent the end of the case, it is a significant step. We at Cal Poly offer our thanks to Sheriff Ian Parkinson and his department, as well as District Attorney Dan Dow and his office, who have worked hard to find answers in this case for Kristen and her family. I know that many across California and the U.S. and many of you here today also thank Chris Lambert for his efforts as well. Last, our thoughts and prayers continue to be with Denise and Stan Smart, all of Kristen's family and friends as this process proceeds. Thank you.
Thank you, President Armstrong. I am prepared to answer any questions that you might have. Just understand, as I stated, that some of the items that I just will not be able to discuss.
When will Paul be extradited to San Luis?
He was driven from San Pedro and booked into San Luis County Jail today already, so he's here.
Sheriff Parkinson, are you guys any closer to finding Kristen at this point? And the search warrants that are being served currently, reason to believe that she may be at Ruben Flores' home or any of the properties belonging to the Flores family?
Well, the first part of the question is, are we any closer? And the answer is yes, I believe we are. But only time will tell. So if obviously we recover, we'd be making that announcement today. In regards to the search warrants, you know, we're after all kinds of things, physical evidence again, anything that might lead us to the location of Kristen. And as you know from the previous search and as you reported from this search, we're out there with, you know, our ground penetrating radar again. So yes, it's safe to say we're checking everywhere possible.
Sheriff Parkinson, when might we see either Ruben or Paul or both in court?
I believe that Paul's arraignment will be on Thursday. It really depends on Ruben. Ruben has the ability to bail out. If he bails out, then he will not be there on Thursday. But if he is still in custody, he will too be in court on Thursday.
Thursday at the latest, then? Is that?
Yes. Yes. Yes, sir. Well, as I've said before, and this case is probably the best illustration of it, is that it's not what you believe, it's what you can prove. So when people ask, why is this taking so long? Because the general public knows this much about the case, and the case is this big. And so as it progresses, you know, and when I talk about that due process rights, we have a right, or we have a duty and obligation to protect people that are innocent as well as guilty. So we can't base arrest on what we might believe. It has to be based on physical evidence.
Hey, Sheriff, you mentioned you can't talk a lot about some of the evidence, but can you talk in general about the physical evidence
let me see if I can answer it this way. Forensic physical evidence was located, and yes, we believe it's linked to Kristen. And yes, we did find physical evidence at least 2 homes.
You also mentioned some information in the podcast. Can you expand on that a little bit?
In regards to what Chris Lambert discovered? Yeah, that comes up every year. So since I've come into office, we have 2 anniversary dates that are really centered around Kristen, and that is her birth date, and that is the date she went missing. That's typically when interviews, people want to interview me or interview the department on Kristen's case. I've always said that those are really good things because it's getting that message out. I think what Chris did with his podcast was he took a local story that was generally locally and he expanded it to a national story, an international, actually, I'll say, because once that message got out, we started getting more information. Now, some of it is information that we already had and knew, but the value to it is that there's, as we see here, there's a lot of people that are students here that aren't from San Luis Obispo. And so when they graduate, a lot of them will leave back to their home area or on to pursue, other jobs. And so they're kind of dispersed all over the country. So as that message gets out to the nation, those people that used to live here during that time might remember something. And so that's always the value of that. And I think what Chris did with the podcast was truly put it out nationally to bring in new information. So it did produce some information that I believe was valuable.
The podcast also talks about some alleged missteps early on in the investigation. Can you talk about that? Do you believe there were missteps early on? Do you think this arrest should have happened, back in 1996, 97?
First to the missteps, yes. I think, there were certainly some missteps. Were there some things that were done really, really well? Yes, too. You can be an investigator and look at a case that was investigated 10 years ago, look at that case and say, well, I wish they would have done this, or I would have done this. So you can always look back and see things that could have been different. But there really is no hiding the fact that there were some mistakes made early on, and it made it much more difficult. That first 48 hours is pretty critical in a missing person or a homicide, and there was mistakes made that made that much harder. And I think that's why when I talk about it's what you can prove, it's not what you believe. I think there's a lot of people that that listen to Chris's podcast and kind of either relived it because they were around during that time or learned of the story, and then what they tended to focus on was, hey, why aren't we moving forward? And trying to really impress upon people that our duty has to be to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not just we believe this person did it and we're going to pull them off the street and deprive them of their freedom.
Finally, you mentioned the search warrant on the phone and the text messages. Does that yield any incriminating information?
Yes, as Denise Smart has said, it's a puzzle, and the puzzle is we're assembling the puzzle. And imagine if you've ever built a puzzle, you've found missing pieces, how frustrating that is because you're looking for the one piece and you find out there's 3 pieces that somebody's taken out of the puzzle or not putting it back. Well, this is what it has been. It's been a puzzle, and it's a very slow process to find each of those little pieces because at the end of the day, we got to see what that puzzle reveals. And so that was something Denise said early on to me, and I absolutely agree with it. That's the slow process of this and finding a little bit each place. So when you ask, was there something of value? My answer would be yes. There was something of value in various locations that kept coming up and coming to light.
Sheriff, could Paul be charged with anything else in addition to murder?
I really think that's a question that the DA is going to have to answer. I mean, once we turn the case over to them, they're the ones that actually file the charges. We know that the 187 of the Penal Code, murder is applicable. Whether or not something else will be, I think that's to be determined by the DA.
I mean, and without finding Kristen, without remains or a body, how confident are you that physical evidence alone will hold up in court?
Well, you know what? You never know. I mean, you can have eyewitnesses, and it doesn't hold up in court because of either the admissibility or believability of the witnesses. So we don't know that until we try it. I'm confident that we have enough of a case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the second part of your question is without Kristen. Well, there's cases all over the nation, what they call no-body homicides. As a matter of fact, there's a case in point that was on 48 Hours up in Placer County where they prosecuted, were successful. It went through appeal, they won, and years later they actually recovered the female victim's body in that case. So it's done all the time. Well, I say it's done regularly is probably a better answer. So yes, I believe it can be done, and I think that the district attorney can be successful because I think there's enough evidence to support it.
My last question is, this is such a high-profile case. I mean, you can see the crowd that this has garnered just for this press conference. Do you think that this is going to be a fair trial in San Luis Obispo County, or will it have to be tried elsewhere?
So it's a good question, and I don't have an answer. Is there a chance that it's going to push for a change of venue? Yeah, absolutely. But that, again, is going to be a court function to determine. That's an item that will be placed in front of a judge to make that determination. It's a belief that he participated. No. Yeah.
Sheriff, does any of the evidence show that Kristen's remains are possibly after the previously searched locations?
Can't comment on that. I can't discuss that other than to say that every location. I think I mentioned that we searched 18 locations, and most of those involved digs. The most significant one being on the hillside behind us. But we're going to continue until we find her.
What's your theory of the crime? How did it happen? What's your theory?
That's something that is presented in court. I can't present a motive or a theory. We that's what court is for.
Sheriff, what about the mom? What about Susan?
That was answered just a little bit ago. You might have missed it.
Sheriff, so for the two men arrested, are they on suicide watch? If not, why?
If not, why? Well, I can tell you this. Anybody that comes in on a high-profile crime, there's probably, I'd say, a dozen people right now in custody for murder. They're all on watch because of the level of their charges. And it's not just murder. It could be, any serious crime or high-profile crime. That's always an issue, and that's always watched for that specific reason.
Sheriff, did the arresting officers, did they give any information as to reaction to when they arrested Paul and Ruben, what their reaction was, or did they say anything?
The only thing that's been relayed to me is that there was virtually zero communication, no response.
Why was a Ramey warrant pursued in this case?
Well, as you know, I'll assume you know that a Ramey warrant is a warrant that allows for a law enforcement officer to go into a home and take somebody. If it was purely an arrest that a peace officer has the authority to make, they could make that in a public place on the street. But if you're going into a house, you cannot make that without an arrest warrant. So in order to make sure that he was in custody, it was imperative that we went to Superior Court and a judge signed an arrest warrant, in this case a Ramey warrant, to allow us, if we needed to go inside a home to take somebody, that we could do that legally.
Where the pictures were taken?
Sorry, let me think. Yeah. Those first two pictures of Paul were taken in San Pedro, and the third one was taken in Rio Grande.
Did Paul or Ruben Flores say anything when they were arrested, and what did they say?
No. Nothing of consequence.
I mean, what was their demeanor? Were they surprised? I heard reports of Paul being in Arroyo Grande over the weekend.
Well, at least it was at the end.
Yeah.
Okay,
I had just a question
I'm sorry.
About their demeanor when they were arrested. We heard that, Paul was here in Arroyo Grande or San Luis Obispo County over the weekend. What was the reason for waiting?
Oh, why not arrest them when he was in Arroyo Grande? We're well aware that he was in Arroyo Grande. We had a warrant to be executed in San Pedro at his residence. So, yes, it could have happened here and we could have gone down there. But, when you set a timeline, when you talk about an operation of that size, when I'm sending, 30 people or 20 people down to Southern California and 20 people here along with forensic people, it's a lot bigger operation than meets the eye. So either when you start planning that and figuring out what personnel you have, once you get to a timeline, it's just better to follow the timeline unless something really changes, and really that didn't change much. Okay, anything further, I'm going to refer you to my PO, Tony Coppola, and thank you for coming today.
East of Eden, running with the wolves to free.